there's no evidence that Iran is ready to knuckle under to US pressure. I think it's more likely that the current hostility will continue. Maybe escalation will come at some point in the future, if not now.
Over the weekend, Donald Trump launched his biggest military operation since he returned to office. Iran said US strikes hit the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, killing a reported 53 people, including 5 children. Edmund Fitton-Brown, former UK ambassador to Yemen. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I'm not surprised by it. This has been something that Donald Trump and his administration have been talking about. Um, or they have had a consistently hard line against Iran and against Iran's allies. And of course, the Houthis are allies of Iran. They're part of the so-called axis of resistance. And I think the statement that Trump made about the reasons for the attacks and the US intent is pretty clear.
The White House said on Sunday that Iran was put on notice to cease support for the Houthis, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth vowing an unrelenting missile campaign until Houthi attacks stop. What is Iran's interest in the Houthis and in the region?
So Iran has, over many years, in fact, you could say over decades, assembled what it calls the axis of resistance, where it has got militias, usually Shia militias, but not always Shia. Some of them are Sunni as well, who have aligned themselves with Iran's interests and enabled Iran to carry out proxy warfare. And so the best known of these militias is the Lebanese Hezbollah group, which of course was being used as an Iranian proxy to attack Israel. Now, you can argue that with the Lebanese Hezbollah having been severely damaged by the Israeli military campaign last year, that now possibly the premier Iranian proxy group is the Yemeni Houthi group.
With the US carrying out strikes on the Houthis, is this a moment of escalation? Could this be a moment that Iran would choose to escalate with direct retaliation?
I think that's unlikely, partly because Iran itself has not been attacked, and the Iranians are very deliberate about the way that they escalate and when they do, as we saw during various phases of escalation between Iran and Israel last year. That said, the US shift of policy since the change of administration has made America much more overtly hostile to Iran, as well as to the Houthis and to the other members of the other components of the axis of resistance. So Iran probably feels that it is under direct threat. And in that respect, how it reacts to that is unpredictable. My guess is that the Iranians would think they had more to lose than to gain by escalating with the Americans at the moment. So my guess is that they will not escalate.
You mentioned there that the Trump White House has ushered in more hostility towards Iran. Apart from that, or maybe including that, how does the Trump White House approach differ from Biden's efforts within the region?
Well, the Biden administration was partly informed by the same group of foreign policy specialists who had served under Barack Obama. And so, if you think back to the Obama administration, where you had the signing of the JCPOA agreement with Iran, which was designed to delay and contain Iran's nuclear ambitions. And if you also look at the way in which the both the Obama administration and then the Biden administration supported the wider international policy towards negotiating some kind of peace outcome in Yemen. This was all very much diplomacy first. It was the idea was we can reach satisfactory outcomes with these aggressive countries or these aggressive militias through diplomacy. And that was, in that respect, of course, the last 14 months, I guess, 15 months of the Biden administration took place after the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October 2023. And again, there was there was a lot of emphasis on diplomacy. That's not to say that the Biden administration didn't support Israel. I think it did support Israel. It supported Israel's right and even referred to its obligation to defend itself. And it was critical of and believed in putting pressure on the Iranians and the axis of resistance. But they were much milder and much more inclined towards diplomatic outcomes, whereas the Trump administration seems to take the view that you show overwhelming strength at the outset. You make it clear to somebody who you consider to be your enemy that you will not tolerate what they're doing. And then I think at the back of that, there is a sense in the Trump administration that they might be willing to do deals, but they always want to do them from a position of strength. So where this goes, I think, depends really on how the Houthis, the Iranians, and others react. It's possible that you'll have a sort of a preemptive scaling down from the Iranian and Houthi side, and the Americans might accept that, and it might lead to some kind of negotiated outcome. But there's no evidence that Iran is ready to knuckle under to US pressure. So I think it's more likely that the current hostility will continue in some form, and that maybe escalation will come at some point in the future, if not now.
Trump, when he was justifying the strikes, referred to them as relentless assaults that have cost the US and world economy many billions of dollars. Can this all be boiled down to US trade interests?
I don't think it's just US trade interests. I mean, I think the way that the White House expressed that was very clear, and I think it was a message that people could readily understand, that we can't have this kind of interference with international trade and this kind of tax on the global economy, effectively, by putting one of the most important shipping lanes in the world out of commission. But I think it's more than that. I think the fundamental point is that the Houthis have thrown down the gauntlet to any idea of international rule of law. They've basically said, we reserve the right to interfere with legal civilian shipping whenever we think that it's necessary to make a point politically. And they have actually attacked ships, and those ships have not been Israeli ships. They've been a range of ships associated with a range of countries and a range of commercial interests. And so I think that even though the White House statement emphasizes the commercial dimension of the Houthi threat, I think it's also their threat to the rule of law.
On that point of the rule of law, I'm wondering, do you see a slight double standard here in that when the Houthis have violated international law, we see the US retaliate with force in the form of strikes, but we've witnessed Vladimir Putin horrifically violate international law and the US refusing to intervene on behalf of the Ukrainians, refusing to offer any form of security backstop?
Well, I think, I don't want to say too much on the Ukrainian side, because I'm not sure that the US position is clear yet. The US is clearly trying to figure out a way forward towards a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. But the messaging about the degree to which they would back Russia or back Ukraine, I think, has been unclear. And there have been some signs that that the White House is prepared to put more pressure on Russia if it considers that Russia is acting as a spoiler and not showing sufficient interest in pursuing a realistic peace process. So I think it's, clearly you have two very different challenges here. You have one in the case of the Houthis that is susceptible to being addressed by direct military power. And the Russia-Ukraine war is a much bigger and much more complicated conflict. And the United States doesn't actually have the ability, or at least I don't think most of the world would want to see the United States try to get directly involved in that. So I think, I don't really like the term double standards because I think each conflict is different and people, I think, rightly apply different standards according to what is realistic.
Interestingly, both those conflicts are related through Iran because we know that Russia and Iran cooperate militarily, and there's an increasing dependence on Iran from Russia for military hardware, especially since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. Do you think that the US actions in Yemen will have any impact on US-Russia relations ahead of this call that we know Vladimir Putin's going to have with Donald Trump tomorrow?
I think probably not. I mean, I think you make an important point about the sort of the connectivity here. One of the things that has struck me about the sort of consistency of purpose of the new US administration is that it has looked very consistent on Iran and on the axis of resistance and people like the Houthis and on it and on Israel and Palestine. There's been a sort of a consistent thrust of pro-Israeli, anti-Iranian policy that you can trace all the way through everything that the Trump administration has so far done in the Middle East, including these attacks on the Houthis. But there isn't that consistency or clarity over the US policy towards Russia. And therefore, it's an oddity that, as you say, Russia and Iran seem to be involved in some form of alliance with each other. They've been mutually supporting each other. Now, that's not necessarily a comfortable relationship between Russia and Iran because Russia has its own Islamic extremism issues. And the Iranians, although in the case of the Iranians, they are the sort of preeminent power of Shia Islam rather than Sunni Islam. Even so, they're instinctively sympathetic to any sort of Islamic constituency that is in conflict with a European constituency like the Russians. So it's sort of an alliance of convenience. It may well be that there's a hope in Washington to break up that alliance, to separate that alliance. I think that the Russian attitude to the Houthis, which has been supportive, they've basically been providing support to the Houthis. And there's been some kind of understanding reached, both with Russia and with China, interestingly, that the Houthis will try not to attack Russian or Chinese interests in the Red Sea. So a kind of a tacit understanding that has been reached there. But I don't think that the Russians regard the Houthis as anything other than a marginal distraction. And I don't think they will regard US enforcement action against the Houthis as a problem.
Edmund, Fitton-Brown, thank you so much for your insight today.
You're welcome. Thank you.